Story 1. The City of Eternal Winter. Winter in Blackridge was unlike anywhere else. The snow never melted, the sky was always overcast, and the wind howled through the streets like a mourning spirit. No one truly remembered when the city had last seen the sun. Nathan, a freelance photographer, arrived in Blackridge on assignment to capture the city's eerie beauty. But as he ventured deeper into the frozen streets, he began to realize that something was terribly wrong. When Nathan first arrived, he was surprised by how quiet the city was. Despite its towering buildings and intricate streets, there were barely any people. The few he saw were bundled in thick coats, walking quickly with their heads down. No one made eye contact. At a small diner, he asked the waitress, an older woman with tired eyes, about the city's strange emptiness. "It's winter," she replied curtly. "People stay indoors. But what about the lights?" Nathan asked. "Most buildings look abandoned." The woman hesitated before leaning in and whispering, "Leave before nightfall." Nathan chuckled nervously, but the woman's face remained grim. As the day went on, Nathan explored deeper into the city. His camera captured haunting images: snow-covered streets, shadowy alleyways, buildings with windows like empty eyes. The silence was oppressive. Then he started hearing things. At first, it was just the wind whispering through the narrow streets. But as he took more photos, the whispers became words. Indistinct at first, but then clear. "Go back." Nathan spun around. The street was empty. He continued, brushing off the uneasy feeling. But as he pressed forward, the whispers grew louder, more desperate. "You shouldn't be here." The wind bit through his coat, but it wasn't just the cold that made him shiver. At dusk, Nathan reached an old plaza covered in thick snow. At its center stood a statue. At least, he thought it was a statue. As he approached, his breath hitched. It was a man, a real man, frozen solid, eyes wide open in terror. His hands were stretched out as if reaching for something or trying to escape. Nathan took a step back, heart pounding. His instincts screamed at him to run. Then he noticed the other figures. Lining the edges of the plaza, half buried in snow, were more people. Frozen, their faces locked in expressions of horror. That's when he heard footsteps behind him. Slow, crunching in the snow. Nathan turned. At the other end of the plaza, barely visible through the swirling snow, stood a figure. It was tall, wrapped in tattered black robes, its face obscured by a hood. The air grew even colder. The whispers returned, now a chorus. "Run!" Nathan stumbled back, his breath coming out in panicked gasps. The figure took a step forward. The whispers intensified, turning into a deafening wail. He ran. His boots slipped on the ice as he sprinted through the empty streets. The city felt like a maze, every corner looking the same. But the thing was still behind him, its presence suffocating. Somehow, he found his way back to his car. Fumbling with numb fingers, he started the engine. The headlights flickered on, and for a brief moment he saw it. The figure stood in the middle of the road, just beyond the reach of his headlights. But now its hood had fallen back. Its face was nothing, a hollow void, darker than the night itself. Nathan slammed his foot on the gas. Nathan never spoke about what happened in Blackridge. He made it out, but something followed. Even back in his warm apartment, he felt the cold. The whispers hadn't stopped. Every time he looked outside during snowfall, he saw figures standing in the distance, watching. And every night, just before he closed his eyes, he heard the voice closer than before. "You should have left before nightfall." The haunted doll, in a small, quaint town nestled among rolling hills. There was an old antique shop that rarely had any customers. Dusty and forgotten, the shop stood at the end of a narrow cobblestone street, its windows covered in grime, and its wooden sign creaking in the wind. One day, A curious young girl named Lucy wandered into the shop, drawn by its mysterious aura. As Lucy explored the dimly lit store, her eyes fell upon an old, dusty doll perched on a high shelf. The doll had glassy blue eyes, a porcelain face, and wore a frilly, faded blue dress. Despite its age, the doll seemed to radiate an eerie charm. Lucy felt an inexplicable connection to it and begged her parents to buy it for her. Reluctantly, her parents agreed, and the doll found a new home. That night, as Lucy slept, she began to hear faint whispers echoing through the room. The whispers were barely audible at first, like the rustling of leaves, but they gradually grew louder. Startled, Lucy opened her eyes and saw the doll sitting on her dresser, its glassy eyes seemingly glowing in the dark. "Lucy, come play with me," the doll whispered, its voice soft but sinister. Terrified, Lucy ran to her parents' room, clutching her teddy bear tightly. She told them about the whispers and the doll's eerie glow, but they dismissed her fears as just a bad dream. Comforting her, they led her back to bed and assured her that everything was fine. The next day, strange things began to happen around the house. Objects moved on their own, books fell off shelves, and doors creaked open and shut without explanation. Lucy's parents grew increasingly worried, but still, they tried to rationalize the occurrences. Meanwhile, Lucy continued to hear the whispers every night, growing louder and more insistent. One evening, as Lucy's parents sat in the living room, they heard a loud crash from Lucy's room. Rushing upstairs, they found the doll lying on the floor, its eyes now glowing brighter than ever. Determined to put an end to the strange events, they decided to return the doll to the antique shop the next day. When they arrived at the shop, the old shopkeeper eyed the doll with a mixture of fear and recognition. "This doll is cursed," he explained. "It has been returned to me many times. The spirit of a vengeful child inhabits it, seeking a playmate for eternity." Despite the shopkeeper's warnings, Lucy's parents left the doll in the shop and hurried home, hoping that would be the end of their ordeal. However, every night, Lucy could still hear the whispers, faint but persistent. The eerie voice seemed to echo in her mind, a constant reminder of the doll's lingering presence. As the days turned into weeks, Lucy's fear grew, and she became withdrawn and quiet. Her parents, desperate to help their daughter, sought the advice of a local medium. The medium performed a cleansing ritual in their home, hoping to banish the spirit of the doll once and for all. For a while, the whispers stopped, and peace seemed to return to their home. Lucy's parents were relieved, thinking they had finally rid themselves of the cursed doll's influence. But one night, as Lucy lay in bed, she heard a familiar voice, soft and sinister. "Lucy, come play with me," the doll whispered, its voice echoing through the darkness. Lucy knew then that the doll's spirit would never truly leave her alone. The connection they had formed was unbreakable, and a vengeful child would forever seek her company. The haunted doll remained a constant, eerie presence in Lucy's life, a chilling reminder of the dark secrets that lurk in shadows. As Lucy grew older, the whispers became a part of her life. Despite her efforts to move on, the doll's spirit persisted. The whispers would come and go, sometimes fading into the background, and other times crescendoing into a chorus of ghostly voices. One day, Lucy decided to confront her fears. She returned to the antique shop, now closed and abandoned. The doll still sat on a high shelf, gathering dust. As Lucy approached, she felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, and the whispers grew louder. "Lucy, come play with me," the doll's voice echoed, determined to end the haunting. Lucy took the doll and drove to a remote forest. She dug a deep hole and buried the doll, hoping to lay the spirit to rest. As she covered the doll with dirt, she heard the whispers one last time, faint and mournful. "Lucy, thank you." Years passed, and Lucy's life slowly returned to normal. The whispers ceased, and the haunting memories of the doll faded. She started a family of her own and found peace in the quiet moments with her children. But one rainy evening, as Lucy and her family sat by the fireplace, her youngest daughter came running into the room, clutching an old, dusty doll with glassy blue eyes and a porcelain face. "Mommy, look what I found in the attic. Isn't she beautiful?" her daughter exclaimed. Lucy felt a chill run down her spine as she stared at the doll. The whispers had returned, and she knew that the spirit of the vengeful child was not yet at peace. The cycle would continue, and the haunted doll would forever be a part of their lives. From that day on, Lucy vowed to protect her family and ensure that the doll's spirit would never harm them. She sought the help of a powerful shaman who performed a binding ritual to contain the spirit within the doll. The shaman placed the doll in a specially crafted box, sealed with ancient symbols and buried deep within the earth. The whispers finally ceased, and Lucy's family could live in peace. But the memory of the haunted doll remained, a reminder of the dark secrets that lurked beneath the surface. Lucy's experience taught her the importance of confronting one's fears and the power of love and determination in overcoming even the most terrifying challenges. The abandoned asylum. Years ago, on the outskirts of a quiet town, there stood an old asylum. This institution had a dark history, plagued by numerous reports of abuse and unexplained deaths. Eventually, the authorities closed it down, and it became a local legend. People whispered that the asylum was haunted by the spirits of tormented patients who had suffered and died within its walls. One cold, moonlit night, a group of adventurous friends, Mark, Sarah, John, and Emily, decided to explore the abandoned asylum. They were determined to prove that the ghost stories were merely myths. Equipped with flashlights and a sense of bravado, they made their way to the eerie, decrepit building. As they approached, the asylum loomed over them, its windows shattered and its doors hanging off their hinges. Vines and ivy had claimed the walls, giving the structure an ominous, forgotten feel. Despite their initial bravado, the friends hesitated at the entrance, exchanging nervous glances. "Come on, it's just an old building," Mark said, trying to muster courage. He pushed open the creaky door, and they all stepped inside. The air inside was musty and cold, filled with the scent of decay and abandonment. Their footsteps echoed through the empty hallways as they wandered deeper into the asylum. Broken furniture, scattered papers, and rusted medical equipment littered the floor. The walls were covered in faded, peeling paint, revealing layers of neglect. "Guys, this place gives me the creeps," Emily whispered, clutching John's arm. He nodded, but they pressed on. As they moved through the dark, decrepit hallways, they began to hear faint cries and footsteps echoing around them. The air grew colder, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled the atmosphere. Shadows seemed to dance on the walls, and the friends couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Suddenly, Mark, who had been leading the way, stopped in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. The others listened intently. There was a faint, distant cry, like a child calling for help. The sound sent chills down their spines. "Let's keep moving," Sarah said, trying to sound confident. "It's probably just the wind." But deep down, they all knew it was something more. As they continued exploring, they stumbled upon an old patient record room. The room was filled with dusty files and records, detailing the lives of the asylum's former patients. Curious, they began to sift through the papers, hoping to find some clues about the hauntings. John picked up a particularly old file and began to read aloud. "Patient Margaret Collins, admitted for severe delusions and hallucinations, claims to see ghosts and hear voices. Sarah gasped. Mark, wasn't your great-grandmother named Margaret Collins? Mark nodded, his face pale. Yes, she was, but I never knew she was admitted here. Realizing the connection, a sense of unease settled over them. They decided it was time to leave. However, as they made their way back to the entrance, the asylum seemed to come alive. Shadows flitted across the walls, and the cries grew louder, echoing through the corridors. Panic set in, and they quickened their pace. Just as they reached the exit, the doors slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging them into darkness. The friends frantically searched for another way out, but it was as if the asylum had trapped them. They could hear Mark's voice, now distorted and otherworldly, calling for help. Please, help me. Mark, where are you? Sarah cried, her voice trembling with fear. I'm here in the darkness. Mark's voice echoed, sending chills down their spines. Desperate to find their friend, they followed his voice, but it seemed to lead them deeper into the labyrinthine halls. The air grew colder, and the sense of dread intensified. They stumbled upon a room filled with old medical equipment, and there, in the corner, they saw Mark. But something was wrong. Mark's eyes were vacant, and his expression was one of pure terror. He was muttering incoherently, as if in a trance. Sarah rushed to him, but as she touched his shoulder, he vanished into thin air. Mark, she screamed, but there was no response. The friends were now more terrified than ever. The asylum's malevolent presence seemed to close in on them, and they realized they were not alone. They could feel the cold, ghostly hands of the tormented spirits reaching out to them, seeking their souls. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, they ran through the dark hallways, their flashlights flickering and dying. The cries and whispers grew louder, filling their minds with fear and confusion. Just when they thought all hope was lost, they stumbled upon a hidden staircase leading to the basement. With no other choice, they descended into the darkness. The basement was even colder and more oppressive than the rest of the asylum. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls seemed to close in around them. They followed the narrow, winding corridor, their breaths visible in the frigid air. At the end of the corridor, they found a locked door. John, using all his strength, managed to break it open. Inside, they discovered a small, dimly lit room filled with old hospital beds and forgotten medical supplies. In the center of the room stood a ghostly figure, a woman in a tattered, blood-stained gown. Her eyes were hollow, and her expression was one of sorrow and anguish. She reached out to them, her voice a haunting whisper. Help us! Free us from this torment. The friends realized that the spirits of the patients were trapped in the asylum, bound by the suffering and pain they had endured. They knew they had to find a way to release them. With newfound determination, they searched the room for anything that could help. In a dusty old book, they found a ritual for cleansing and banishing malevolent spirits. It required a personal item from each spirit, a circle of protection, and a series of incantations. The friends gathered the items and set to work. They drew the circle of protection and began the ritual, chanting the incantations. As they did, the air grew colder, and the spirits of the patients appeared around them, watching with hope and fear. As they completed the final incantation, a powerful gust of wind swept through the room, and the spirits began to fade. The ghostly figure of Margaret Collins, Mark's great-grandmother, appeared before them, her expression one of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered before vanishing into the ether. The asylum's oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the friends felt a sense of peace settle over them. They knew the spirits were finally at rest, exhausted but relieved, they made their way back to the entrance. This time, the doors opened easily, and they stepped out into the cool night air. The asylum stood silent and empty behind them, no longer a place of torment. As they walked away, they knew they would never forget the harrowing experience. The legend of the haunted asylum had been laid to rest, but the memory of the spirits they had freed would stay with them forever. The phantom hitchhiker. Late one stormy night, a man named John was driving down a desolate country road. The night was pitch black, and the rain poured down in torrents, making visibility nearly impossible. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of his car engine and the occasional splash of tires hitting puddles. The road stretched endlessly before him, flanked by dense woods on either side. Suddenly, through the sheets of rain, John saw a figure standing by the roadside. The figure was drenched with an outstretched thumb and seemed to glow faintly in the headlights. Feeling a pang of sympathy, John pulled over and rolled down his window. "Need a ride?" he asked, shouting to be heard over the rain. The hitchhiker, a young woman, nodded and quickly got into the car. She was wearing a simple white dress, now soaked through, and her long hair clung to her face. She looked up at John with grateful eyes and thanked him with a soft, almost ethereal voice. "Thank you so much. I'm heading to the old house on Elm Street," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. John nodded and started driving again. The young woman remained silent for the rest of the journey, staring out the window as the rain continued to pour. John couldn't shake the odd chill that hung in the air, but he brushed it off, attributing it to the cold and damp weather. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at the destination, a dilapidated old house on Elm Street. The house looked abandoned, with overgrown weeds and broken windows. John turned to tell the woman they had arrived, but to his shock, the passenger seat was empty. The young woman had vanished without a trace. Confused and frightened, John got out of the car and approached the house. He knocked on the door, and after a few moments, an elderly woman answered. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, and she looked at John with a mixture of curiosity and sadness. "Excuse me, ma'am," John began, his voice trembling. "I just gave a young woman a ride here, but she disappeared. She said she was coming to this house." The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears. "My daughter, Emily, died in a car accident on that road 10 years ago," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Every year, on the anniversary of her death, she appears as a hitchhiker, seeking help to return home." John felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized he had encountered the phantom hitchhiker. The encounter was a chilling reminder of the lingering presence of the past. Epilogue. John couldn't shake the eerie feeling of his encounter with the phantom hitchhiker. The memory haunted him, and he couldn't help but wonder why Emily's spirit lingered on that desolate road. Determined to find answers, he returned to the old house on Elm Street the following day. The elderly woman, Mrs. Thompson, welcomed him inside and offered him a cup of tea. Her eyes still held the same sorrowful look, but she seemed grateful for John's concern. "Please, tell me more about Emily," John asked gently. "I want to understand why she still appears on that road." Mrs. Thompson sighed and began to recount the tragic story. Emily was a vibrant, kind-hearted girl. She was full of life and always willing to help others. On the night of the accident, she was driving home from a friend's house when her car skidded off the road and crashed into a tree. She died instantly. It broke my heart, and I've never fully recovered from the loss. John listened intently, his heart aching for the grieving mother. "Do you think there's a way to help her find peace?" he asked. Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly. "I've tried everything, prayers, rituals, even speaking with mediums, but nothing has worked. Perhaps she needs to know that I forgive her and that she can move on." Determined to help, John suggested they visit the accident site together. Mrs. Thompson agreed, and they drove to the spot where Emily had lost her life. The place was eerily quiet, with only the sound of rustling leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. They stood by the roadside, and Mrs. Thompson began to speak softly, her voice filled with love and sorrow. "Emily, my dear, if you can hear me, please know that I love you and forgive you. It's time for you to find peace and move on. You don't have to linger here anymore." As she spoke, a gentle breeze swept through the trees, and a sense of calm seemed to settle over the area. John could feel the change in the atmosphere, and he knew that Emily's spirit had finally found the closure it needed. They returned to the old house, and Mrs. Thompson thanked John for his kindness and support. John knew he had done something meaningful, and as he drove away, he felt a sense of peace himself. From that day on, John never saw the phantom hitchhiker again. The desolate road remained just that, a road free from the lingering presence of a lost soul. John's encounter with Emily's spirit had taught him the power of compassion and the importance of helping others find closure.